Hi, this is Simon Obstall and welcome to another tutorial for Blackmagic Fusion. Now, somebody asked me how I would go about recreating the Blend If tool that features in Adobe Photoshop. And I thought that it would be a really interesting project to look at because it means we can look at some very useful theory along the way. And we'll end up with a tool that actually has quite a lot of use to it as well. So before we get started in Fusion, perhaps we should look at Photoshop and see how this blend if function actually works. So I'm sure you've seen this kind of effect in magazines and whatever. It's very popular because it's built right into Photoshop. So essentially what we have here is a background layer that looks like that. I've got a text layer that looks like that, to which the blend if function has been applied. So double click on the layer, brings up the layer style, and you can adjust the blend if from here. As we adjust the grayscale controls, we can have a sharp cutoff like so, or we can split that control and have a softer blend like that. And I've done exactly the same thing with this top layer here. So originally it looked like that, and then we just adjust these controls till we get something like this. Basically, as you can see from these controls here, it's using the grayscale values of the layer, or indeed the underlying layer, and then creating a blend depending on those grayscale values. So here we are in Fusion, and I've got two of my images loaded up. Now I want to start quite simply with this, so you get an understanding of some basic theory, and then I'll complicate it later on. So the first thing we need to do, obviously, is we need to create a grayscale map that we can use to generate the blend. So I'm going to use the river image. So how are we going to create grayscale? This is a subject that I've covered extensively in my Understanding Brightness tutorial. I link to that in the description. So there are several different ways in which you can calculate grayscale. Commonly we talk about luma and luminance, and we use the terms almost always completely incorrectly. There are other things like value, which is the V in HSV, and there's lightness, which is the L in HSL, and so on. What I'm going to use here is a simple option, which I think is probably what Photoshop is using, and that's the average of the three channels. So to achieve that, I'm going to add a custom tool, and let's pipe the river into it. So to get our average, all we need to do is, in this field here, type open brackets R1 plus G1 plus B1 close brackets over 3. So that's obviously the average of the three channels, and just paste that into each of the expressions for the color. So now we get that, which is a grayscale of our river image. And that's very, very similar in actual fact to luminance, but it's not, of course, the same thing. However, it's good enough for this purpose. So next, let's look at the blend operation. Now, it's called blend if, which implies that there's a conditional. So if such and such a condition is met, then execute this result. So let's actually interpret it in that way. I'm going to add another custom tool, and I'm going to take my river color image and make that input 1. And then I'm going to take the eyes and make that image input 2. And then I'm going to take my grayscale and make that image input 3. So over in the Channels tab, we're going to enter this expression. So if open brackets C3 is less than N1, comma, C1, comma, C2 close brackets. Let's paste that into the 3 expression fields. So what that means is if the grayscale input value from image 3 is less than N1, our number control N1, then return image 1, otherwise return image 2. So that's a straight conditional, an if expression. So now we can come to our N1 value, and we can just adjust that like so, and you see we get a basic blend if operation. And what we could also do is, after this custom tool, which is providing us with our grayscale, we could add, for example, a brightness contrast, and then we can use these values here to adjust the blend as well. But the problem about this is because it's a straight conditional, it only has two options. Either we've got a pixel from the foreground or we've got a pixel from the background, and we can't create a nice smooth blend between them. So we need to approach it a different way, and a conditional is not the right way of doing it. What we need to realize is that blendIf, despite its name, is not actually a conditional. It's just a straight source over or normal operation. And for more description of that, I would recommend you check out my tutorial on blend modes in my Compositing School series. So I've just swapped the image 1 and image 2 inputs here just to keep this consistent with what we've seen before. So what we're going to do is enter a source over or normal expression into the red, green and blue fields. And that expression is open brackets C1 times C3 close brackets plus open brackets C2 times open brackets 1 minus C3 close brackets. And you can see we've got a nice smooth blend here now of the two images that's based on this grayscale here. And if we come to our brightness contrast, we can get more of the effect that we were seeing before, but it's really quite nice and smooth. So let's talk about this brightness contrast control, because we're going to be building our own control to affect this. And the reason we're going to do it is because although this is effectively compressing the black and white values, what it doesn't do is give us independent control over the feather of these values. Now, there is a tool in Fusion that you could use for this, but I think it would probably be rather cumbersome. And anyway, we're here to learn theory, not just to use the built-in tools. So let's discard this brightness contrast and build our own. So I've removed the original custom tool and the brightness contrast, and this is our image 3 pipeline here. And I'm going to add a custom tool in here. And the first thing we want to do is come over to the intermediate tab, and in I1, we're going to enter our average expression. And then in I2, we're going to enter this expression, open brackets I1 minus N1, close brackets, over, open brackets, N2 minus N1, close brackets. Now, this is a basic compress expression. That's probably exactly what we are getting with that brightness contrast control. And if we now use I2 for each of these channels, so enter I2 for RGB, we can use the N1 and N2 controls as the black and the white respectively. So I'm going to set that N2 value to 1 because that is the white value. And then if we reduce the white value, you can see that that's compressing. We should be looking at this on the left-hand side here. You can see that that compresses the white, and then we can compress the black as well. So we're just narrowing the range of values exactly as we were doing with the brightness contrast. So to visualize this more clearly, I want to use a Grayscale Ramp. So this is the background tool set to gradient, and we're going to pipe that into the custom tool. And let's look at that on the right-hand side as well, and then bring up the waveform overlay. So we're looking at the same image on both sides here. Let's just have a verify what happens with this. You can see this is the black control here. This is the white control. You can understand why we're talking about compression, because effectively we're compressing the range of values. There's all black here, all white here, and we've got a very, very narrow range here. So we've compressed the overall image into this narrow space here. So I want to reset that black value and set that white value to 1. And I want you to look at what happens with the slope as we adjust the black value, because this is the important thing we need to address here. You see that although we're increasing the amount of black, what we're also doing is we're progressively affecting everything from white on downwards. But in this instance, we want to be able to preserve the upper area, or rather treat the upper area independently from the lower area. And that's pretty much the basis of getting this effect to work. So we will have to rewrite our custom tool accordingly. So let's come into the intermediate tab. We can leave I1 as it is. For I2, we're going to enter the following. So that's I1 times, open brackets, 1 over N1, close brackets. And for I3, we're going to enter N1 plus N2. So N2 is going to be our upper control for this black value. And to I4, we'll add this expression, which is a modified version of the compress that we used earlier. So that's open brackets I1 minus N1 close brackets over open brackets I3 minus N1 close brackets. And then for I5, we're going to enter min open brackets I4 comma I1 close brackets. So I5 is going to be our final output value, so we need to enter that into the RGB expression fields. So let's do that. And now if we come to our controls, N1 is our black value and N2 is our feather value. So I'm going to set that feather value to 0 for the time being, and then just let's look at what happens if I adjust my black value. You can see we've now got this step. So everything below that is thresholded to black. So we've come back to the idea of a threshold, almost like that original thing that we looked at with the conditional. But what we can now do rather nicely is we can use the N2 to break that and make a smooth feather back to the original value, back to the default line, I should say. So you can see that feather value can be adjusted all the way up to 1, in which case we're back to the default, or all the way down to 0 to make a hard threshold. So we've created now the black control, and I want to do the white control, and we could do it all within this same custom tool, but it would get a little bit confusing and much easier for you to understand if I separate them out, and there's no harm in doing it that way anyway. So I've renamed that custom tool as black, and I'm going to copy and paste it. So Command C, Command V, and this second instance I've renamed white. So here we need to set up the intermediate values a little bit differently. The first two are fine. The intermediate 3, we need to enter N1 minus N2 rather than plus N2. For intermediate 4, we need to enter the following: open brackets I1 minus I3, close brackets, over open brackets N1 minus I3, close brackets. And then this final value here, we need to swap the min to max. So that's max, open brackets, I4, comma, I1, close brackets. So now let's have a look at what that is looking like. We need to come over to our white controls because these are not quite right. Let's set the N2 value to 0, and we can adjust the N1 value. So let's set it at a default of 1, and then you'll see that just as with the black, with a 0 feather, a 0 number for N2, we get this hard threshold for white, and then we can soften that using the N2 value. So now, between these two custom versions of the same custom tool, we have a much, much more usable control that's exactly what we need for this purpose. So that was probably all a little bit confusing. So let me try and do a little bit of explanation without going into too much detail. I'm just going to bypass that white value just temporarily, and let's come back to the black and try and understand what each of these are doing. We know what I1 is doing, so that's our average. And here in I2, all I'm doing is basically doing a multiplication of the average by the N1 value, but simply 1 divided by the N value so that the control operates in the way that we expect it to. N1 plus N2, all we're doing here really is enabling the N2 slider to be this feather control here. Then we come to our compression expression, and the magic, however, happens in I5. So if I reset that to simply be I4 without the min expression, you can see what happens. The result shoots all the way off up to the top here, and the white value is affected as well. But the min expression chops it off at exactly this point because we're using the minimum result of the two values. So I1 is lower than I4 would have been, And so therefore that's what we're getting everywhere above this threshold, which is basically the N1 value plus the N2 value. So that's probably still a little bit complicated, but hopefully that's given you a little bit of a taster of how it all works. So to give you a better understanding of how this works in terms of the blend if, let's use this grayscale ramp as the input to the image 3 input to the blend if operation. And you can see, hopefully, that wherever it's black, we're getting only the river. Wherever it's white, we're getting only the eyes. And in this grey area in the middle, we're getting a blend between the two. That black is got a softness value, so let's set that to 0. And you can see now we get a hard divide between those values. Let's also set the white down to 0 as well. And you can see how that works. But if we increase those softness values, it smooths out the result. But these two are independent. Whatever I do to the black doesn't affect any of the white and vice versa. So that's why we've set it up in this particular way. So to make this a bit more useful, we need to convert these screw controls into slider controls and set limits for them. So if you right-click on here on the black, I'm going to edit controls, and let's look for number 1 and set that to be a slider control rather than screw. Let's set the default to be 0 because that's our black value, and let's set the allowable range to be 0 and 1, I think, as well. And then if we come back, you'll see it over in our user tab here. We've now got the black control, and it's got a more sensible range. What we also need to do is to rename it. So number 1 needs to be black threshold, and number 2 needs to be called feather or something like that. So I'll quickly set up the N2 value as well. So edit controls, find the number 2 value, and let's set it to be a slider control. Again, let's set its default to 0 and its allowable range to 0 to 1. So now we've got that on the user tab as well. Much easier to use these slider controls than the screw controls. And you wanted to do the same thing for the white. So what I've also done is I've taken these two and made a macro of them, and that macro lives here. Macro, I've called it compress with feather, and it looks like that. I've set my white threshold to be 0.9, my black threshold to be 0.1, and the default feathers to be 0. So if we look at how that's working, so there's our background tool. You can see those two little areas of black and white there. And we can now use that to build the rest of our blend if operation. So because we want to be able to affect both layers separately, or both grayscale images separately, we'll be using this compress on both input images. So I'm going to use it for the river there. Let's disconnect all of this and move it out of the way. We don't need that. And make a copy of it. And then we'll also pipe our eyes into it as well. So there's the eyes, there's the river, both of them grayscale. Now we need to find a way of combining those two so we can just have one single matte that comes into our blend if operation. And I think the simplest way of doing that, and the most productive, is to use a channel Booleans. We could build a channel Booleans, but the tool is sitting there, so let's use it. So let's bring in a channel Booleans, and we will use these two as the input. So for the channel Booleans itself, we're going to set it up this way. We've looked at it over there. We're going to set the operation to maximum, although actually we've got a lot of interesting choices later on down the line if we want to experiment. For now, I'm going to choose maximum, and then the alpha foreground needs to be set to do nothing. And so then we can use this as the image 3 input to our blend if operation. So pipe it in like that, and let's look at the result. And so now we've got the basis of our effect. So if I come down to the compress tool for the eyes and adjust the black threshold, we can start to get to the place that we want to be. So we can increase it really quite a lot and then feather it. We can adjust the white as well. We've got lots of control over of how our composite is working. If we want to make that much more solid, we can increase that and so on. And the feather is working really nicely, as you can see there, that we can just, down here, we can really spread out those values. There's just one other thing I'd like to point out, and that is that We probably ought to add to the end of this a clamp so that none of the values exceed 1 or go below 0. So to do that, I'm going to add a custom tool after the channel booleans. And what we're going to do is come over to the channels, and into the red field, we're going to type this expression: max, open brackets, min, open brackets, C1, comma, 1, close brackets, comma, 0, close brackets. And that, if we paste that into each of the fields, is now a clamp operation. So we've clamped the output of that channel booleans to keep those values within range. Out of range values will, with this operation, create unwanted colors, very unexpected results. It's always a good idea when you're combining mats just to add a clamp at the end of them. So just finally, to wrap this up, I've recreated in Fusion the effect that we had in Photoshop. So looks more or less the same, not identical, obviously. And I've used my own macro that I've created out of basically exactly what I've just shown you. So I've blended the text element over the river, like so, with the trees masking the text rather nicely. And then I've added the eyes over the top like that. Now, just a word about this. Some quite nice features here. Obviously, you've got all your threshold controls for the A and B side. You've got the channel booleans here from which you can select whichever mode you want. You can switch the sources around. So rather than having to manually replug the two inputs, you can switch the sources using the switch source button like that. And you've got the option to view the mat. So view the mat like that. And that's looking at the combined mat. But we can also look at the individual mats. So that's the mat for the river and that's the mat for the text. That's the combined mat view. So as you can see, that's quite a handy tool overall. And I'll put a link to that in the description along with the link for the compress tool. So I hope that's been useful and you've picked up some valuable theory along the way. Thanks very much indeed for watching and hope to see you again soon.